Well, good morning, everyone. My name is Anthony Bly. I'm a soils field specialist with SDSU Extension. Glad to have you join us this morning. We're going to try something a little bit different. It's our first panel discussion during the crop hour. It's intended to be for the attendees, for you, to engage in discussions with us and others about transitioning to what we call soil health practices. So a lot of things included in that. So what we're going to do is we're going to go around and self-introduce ourselves, and then Sara will lead us into talking about the document that we published, and then we'll take it from there. So David, want to go?
Good morning, everyone, and welcome to our third day of this week, Soil Health and Cover Crops Week. Like Anthony said, it's going to be more, our intention anyways is to be more interactive type of conversation today. I'm an agronomy field specialist based out of Watertown. I've been with Extension since 2014 August, to be exact. And prior to that, I worked with Dr. Pete Sexton for about a year down at the Southeast Research Farm. Worked on cover crops a little bit there. And prior to that, both of my graduate degrees, master's and PhD, are from SDSU. So all in all that being said, I've been in South Dakota, Brookings and Watertown for more than 16 and a half years. And I'm glad to be here today, and hopefully with our discussion, we can all learn something from each other. That was our intention, and to have this kind of session rather than having a one-directional PowerPoint presentation type thing, as to we've been getting this question about transitioning to no-till, especially, and other soil health practices, and we thought we will, we'll benefit from this kind of session today, and we'll welcome you all.
Garrett, do you want to be part of the panel? You can introduce yourself. You're on tomorrow. We're featuring you tomorrow, but go ahead.
Hello. Yeah, I will do a short presentation tomorrow on interactions with herbicides and cover crops. But I'm Garrett Schaefer. I'm the weeds field specialist for SDSU Extension. Been in this position for going on about 5 years almost in May. And yeah, so any questions about cover crops, herbicides? I love to field, or where else you got?
Sara, I think you're next.
All right, my internet connection's being a little iffy, so you'll have to send me a message if I freeze up. I'm Sara Bauder. I'm an agronomy field specialist. I work out of Mitchell Regional Center is my home base. Live down near Tyndall, and I kind of focus on general agronomy, a lot like David and I share similar positions in different parts of the state, but I tend to focus a little bit on forages and soils, more so on the plant end of how plants affect soils. Anthony is the true soil guru. So I think if that's everyone introduced, we're going to start off by just introducing a document that was co-authored by several of us and Peter Sexton, and I've put it in the chat here if you want to follow along in real time. It is on our website, and so it's called Transitioning to Soil Health Systems in Eastern South Dakota. And I cannot take the credit. I'd say Anthony and David and Peter probably did more work on this than I did, but this document was really something we felt was needed because we have over the years gotten a lot of questions about transitioning to soil health systems, what that looks like, and how that can be done in a profitable way, of course, for you as a producer or a person in ag business. So we're just going to I'm going to briefly go over what this publication looks like. It is in print, and if you want a print copy, I guess we didn't talk about this, but you can let us know, and I think we could probably mail you a print copy. That shouldn't be an issue. So just let us know in the chat or Q&A if you'd like one. Otherwise, this is straight off the website, what you're seeing here. So at the beginning of the document here, we talk about the principles of soil health. And in South Dakota, we have 5. So we'll go over these maybe a little bit more with some pictures if we have time later, but soil armor, reducing and stopping soil disturbance, AKA moving to minimum or no tillage, enabling a living root through the growing season, so using cover crops and getting that root living as long as you can. Crop plant diversity, crop rotations, essentially. And then number 5 is livestock integration into croplands. And this is just a way to kind of bring things full circle. This isn't always an option for everyone, but that is one of our principles in South Dakota. So we thought that was a good way to start the document. And then we kind of summarize what all of those principles mean. And the first one there, soil armor, is probably the one that we help people to adapt to as quick as they can. And that simply means keeping the soil covered and keeping whatever residue we can on that soil. So then we move into transitioning and what that looks like with no-till as a base practice. So there's a lot of pictures in this document and of course data that's local to South Dakota. This photo here is a really good one just to kind of show you what happens when we lose our soil armor and when it goes somewhere we don't want it to be. So talking about that, when we talk a little on soil fertility, you can see there's a soil nutrient assessment piece here. And, you know, if you look at this particular picture, you can see we lost a lot of soil nutrients that headed to the ditch. So we also went over seed selection. So that can be very important. I often say as an agronomist, this is one of the most important things that is overlooked on a farm. It's really taking the time to choose the right seed for you. And then planter adjustments when we move into no-till and minimum tillage, of course, making sure that we have the planter set properly with the right down pressure is very important. And I don't know, anyone that wants to chime in here, Anthony, David, or Garrett sure can, but I'd say that down pressure and planter settings are overlooked big time. When people first get started, that could be one of the biggest hurdles that's easy to fix, you know, that we just see people overlook.
Absolutely, Sarah, I agree with that. And that picture right there is actually from the Bly farm. So that's a mistake that my father and I made, and I'm not embarrassed or ashamed of that at all, because that's the learning process. And that, you know, that is sidewall compaction in its truest, rawest form. Yep. And yes, Sarah, you're right on track. When we stop relying on tillage to do the primary work in the soil for us and let the biology and microbiology do the work, your planter is your main piece of equipment. And you're exactly right. Setting that is crucial.
Anthony, you want to say anything there at that point about, you know, phosphorus levels and banding fertilizer, where, you know, that might be important to get some phosphorus in furrow if you're short?
Sure, we're kind of perusing through this document first, Peter, and then hopefully we get a few questions, but we can return back to that very, very quickly as well. Did you want to introduce yourself, Peter? Peter Sexton just came on.
Yeah, my name is Pete Sexton. I'm the supervisor of the Southeast Research Farm, and I apologize for being late. I had a little trouble with my internet connection.
No problem, Peter. Glad to have you. Go on, Sarah.
Okay. So the next section here, we kind of go over crop rotations and give some examples. Of course, we can't lay out a crop rotation for the state of South Dakota, right? That depends on every location and your equipment and availability and soils. But there's some great examples here that have been laid out of what you could have for crop rotation that would fit into your particular operation. And a lot of times this is a hurdle for people because if they have been in a corn, soybean, or corn on corn rotation for a long time, it's a change and it's a crop to learn about perhaps, but we're happy to help in that process. And this document kind of gives you some examples. Then it goes into, here's a great picture of, you know, what that can look like when we've got something interseeded or seeded just following another crop. And you can see it gets a little in depth with each example. But that's more of a, you know, one-on-one situation. These are just examples and suggestions. Then we get into soil compaction, the hidden yield robber, which is a great way to say it because it's not something we can just measure real quickly, right? Soil fertility, we can measure, maybe herbicide carryover, we can measure, but soil compaction is a little tougher. You know, a lot of times where it's at, but we don't know how much it's hurting you. So efficiency of where you drive, looking at the size of your equipment. This is a great example here. I understand why people use grain carts. I think we all understand that, but the bigger the equipment is, perhaps maybe the quicker or handier, but the more down pressure and compaction you're putting on your soils. So do think about that. This single axle is putting an awful lot of compaction down when that grain cart is full. And I am not saying anything bad about Kinsey. I'll throw that in there.
Correct.
So
Correct.
they're not the only ones that manufacture these by any means. There is some tables in here. You can take a closer look when we're not scrolling. I don't want to make you seasick. And then we get into some solutions for soil compaction. So we all have issues with soil compaction to some degree because you have to drive on the field. So what are some ways that we can avoid that and mitigate that? The document also goes over cover crops briefly. Now, of course, cover crops, it could have its own document, but there's just some reasons for having cover crops. When we talk about, soil aggregation, capturing that extra nutrients and sunlight, protecting the soil. The list goes on and on. Living root, that's a huge one with cover crop. We can keep our root living longer. And then there's some management suggestions here. So having some goals and looking at, things like your crop rotation, your herbicide history. Insurance is always an important one when we talk about cover crops and your farm service agency programs. And then of course the price, how are we going to terminate it? And can we control the weeds in our cover crop mixtures specifically? So just going over a few things there, and then we summarize at the end and get into some of our references here. But our goal today is not to read you this document. We just wanted you to see it, know that it's out there. And like I said, the link is in the chat. But I think at this time, Anthony put together some slides, but we were hoping that if you had questions, you could certainly put them in the Q&A or the chat if you'd like to. Or if we don't have questions yet, we can turn it over to Anthony, but we open the floor here to any questions you may have at this time.
Why don't we scroll back up to that graph? I think it's on page 2, Sarah. Peter brought in that.
Oh yeah, yep. Let's go
that point, and let's just kind of kick it off with that. We can always, we've got plenty of time, go into those. There it is, right there. Can you make that bigger?
There we go.
Okay.
Yep.
Okay, it's getting bigger.
All right.
So yeah, Peter mentioned,
bigger yet?
banding and broadcasting, and Peter, did you want to make some comments about that?
Well, I was just thinking if since we're talking about planter settings and in-furrow fertilizer, that it's a bigger deal if your soil test level is low than if it's higher.
Correct.
And also the other thing kind of side of that with the fertility management is you're going to need more nitrogen initially in your system because you're building soil organic matter. So those are two kind of things to think about if you're transitioning towards no-till. You know more about that stuff than I do, Anthony. So
no, that's fine. I mean, I'm glad that you brought that up. So this graph is included in that document. It summarizes a whole bunch of work. I realize it's maybe older data, but phosphorus interactions and dynamics in the soil really don't change that much since we really started working with it. And so this one graph summarizes a lot of the work that I helped Dr. Ron Gelderman do and Jim Gerwing do. And we were looking at comparing banded phosphorus to broadcast phosphorus. And so I developed this summary out. We need one way to summarize all the data and present it to you so that you can understand it. And so this is a comparison of all the band and all the broadcast yield comparisons that we had, and I separated it by soil test. And so that's what you see on the horizontal axis there, the x-axis. So we have groupings there, 4 to 6 part per million Olsen, 6 to 8, and then 10. And then 1, I had to put all of the yields on a relative scale because they're all over the board, right? Because we did this work all over South Dakota and had yield ranges from 80s, 100s to 120s up to 200 and even higher. So we put that all on a relative scale. And what it shows here is that at the lower soil test, the 4 to 6 part per million range, that the band treatment out yielded the broadcast. And it's about 90, not quite 95%. So we're losing about 5% of our yield if we would broadcast when the soil tests are low. Now, as we go up, that gap closes. And by the time we get to 10 part per million and higher, there is really no difference because we have enough phosphorus in the soil matrix that roots can access them, okay, at that higher soil test level of phosphorus. So very critical that if you're managing your soil test P low, in the very low category, if you take over a new piece of ground or whatever, that you use the soil test to maybe guide those decisions. And so definitely banding with low soil test P is an advantage. And as Peter mentioned, putting that in the furrow is a good way to do that. Of course, we have to realize that there are limitations and we want to prevent seed injury as well. But with corn, we could get by with, up to 5 gallons of 1030 furrow is very safe. Up to 8 gallons is safe as well. But then we have to start to question, are we in a sandy soil or is the soil very dry? And then we want to make sure we limit it at that point. So with that, we have some questions, Sara, David, Garrett, Peter. I think I see something there.
We had a note in the chat about the link, which I will share as soon as I'm done sharing my screen. But if people have questions, please throw them in the chat or the Q&A. Looks like we got the link in there.
Yeah,
Thanks,
okay.
Matt.
That's what that was about. Sorry, I was excited.
Nope, that's fine. This is meant to be a discussion, so please feel free to kick off the conversation. If you are shy, the Q&A feature only panelists can see. So if you want to ask a question anonymously, you can put it in there, or you can throw questions into the chat. And maybe I can stop sharing, Anthony, if you want to pull up some pictures.
Why don't we continue on Peter's discussion about the extra nitrogen and, scroll down a little bit there in that document?
I actually personally have the same question, Anthony, to you is why is that extra nitrogen? We have a belief that 30 pounds type thing. So why what's the difference between nitrogen becoming readily available to two different tillage systems, or why or how it is different,
Yeah, there it is right there, figure 2. Again, I was in the center. I had the great opportunity to learn from some great people. And Dr. Gelderman and Jim Gerwig and Howard Woodard, Dr. Woodard, so we did this work and we actually had a set of plots where we had tilled and no-till plots randomized together in 4 replications, and we maintained those. And about the 8th year, the no-till thing was coming around, and we were talking about carbon and organic matter and somewhat the importance of that, but that was way back in the late 90s. And we decided to put a nitrogen study out. Does till need more or less than no-till, or vice versa? And what we measured both at Beersford and at Brookings a few times was this difference. And you can see by the arrows there that we didn't fit a line to this data, but we drew in the plateaus where we thought the plateaus were. And the apex of that point, there's roughly a 30-pound difference between them, and that's those arrows. And this happened more than just a few times. And so what happens, David and everyone else, as you change a system from tillage to no-till, and even the step of adding cover crops can be a considerable change. We build carbon in the soil, and that carbon and nitrogen ratio wants to equal out. And so we need more nitrogen to build that carbon. And so we change that system. We gotta put some more nitrogen in this system. Now, at the time in the late 90s, nobody was talking about legumes, and hardly anyone was talking about cover crops. The ARS was probably just beginning to talk about cover crops. But our answer was, well, you need to apply more nitrogen fertilizer. And so hence the recommendation that, when you're converting to no-till, apply 30 more pounds of nitrogen. Now, Sara came along. Go down to your graph. Now it's Peter and Sarah's turn to talk about this. Sara came along, did her thesis on this very thing at the Southeast Farm. So I'll let them talk about their graph, figure 3.
Looks like I saw Pete unmuted himself, so I was going to let him talk unless he wants me to.
Basically, we found that this is a system that's been in no-till for about 15, 16 years. No,
30.
I misspoke there. Yeah, it's been
30
30
years,
now.
29 years at the time or something like
When
that.
you did the study, I think it was 25 years, 26 years. So it's been in
Okay.
no-till for over 20 years. And basically we saw that the nitrogen rates topped out similarly for the no-till and the conventional till. That was the big picture there. So we didn't see, as I recall, we didn't see that much difference in the nitrogen response. So Sara, why don't you go a little further here with this?
Sure. You guys are making me jog my memory. Okay. So yeah, I think that's right. It was 26 years or something like that of no-till at the time. And there's really not a lot of that around research-wise, especially in southeastern South Dakota. So it's kind of a neat study. This is a 2-year study, and we've got a couple planting dates. I think sometimes this graph is a little hard to look at, but if you look, we've got an early and a late planting date, which wasn't intentional, but it actually turned out to be kind of neat to see. And so if you look at the 2 darker colors there, the 2 blues, those are our conventional tillage plots. And those have been conventional tillage, I think, forever, as long as that's been farmed. And you can see that arrow is pointing to where we kind of maxed out optimum nitrogen rate versus yield. And that in those, the no-till versus the conventional till in both situations, based on planting date, you can see that it's very similar to Anthony's data earlier. If you look at like I said, the 2 blue lines, that's our conventional till, just at 2 different planting dates, and basically a little bit lower yielding there for our late planting date, as one would expect. And then if we look at the gray line and the yellow line, those are our no-till lines, and you can see that that optimal N rate does change slightly, but it's really, I would say there wasn't a whole lot of change from the earlier data that Anthony found, other than the fact that the longer we're in no-till, we saw that in some of the data anyway, Pete, you can correct me if I'm wrong, you really didn't need all that much extra nitrogen.
Yeah, that's the way I would interpret this. So if you look at your top 2 lines there, that's your conventional till versus your no-till with a May 5th planting date.
At the typical planting date, yeah.
Yeah,
They're
and
pretty
so
much
the no-till is more responsive to nitrogen than the conventional till. So it's more important, like if you look at the 0, the no-till is quite a bit less than the conventional till with no nitrogen. But when you look at where they peak out there, depending on how you draw that plateau, somewhere around between 100 and 150 pounds per acre, they're peaking out at about the same nitrogen rate. So what that means is, to kind of put this in the big picture, just looking at those top 2 lines, when you start the system out, when you initially convert to no-till, you're building soil organic matter. You need to invest that extra nitrogen in order to build the organic matter. So you need that 30 extra pounds of nitrogen because you're building the system up. And that's what Anthony had reference to a moment ago. Then in this case, you're looking at a system that's been no-till for over 20 years. Now it's kind of reached a new plateau, and we don't see that continued requirement for extra nitrogen because the system reached a new level. And so the nitrogen requirement is the same with the no-till versus the conventional till, would be the answer there. The no-till is more responsive to nitrogen, so as you see more of a deficit if you don't get enough nitrogen on. But once you get to the point where it's economically optimum, it's going to be similar in a mature system.
Right.
I don't know,
Yeah.
Anthony, did I capture that? Is that what you're looking for there?
Absolutely. And today in 2021, this has even further implications because we're talking about carbon markets. And if we've been in no-till system for a long time and haven't used any cover crops or, livestock integration, we've probably plateaued out. We've come to a new equilibrium of carbon, and that we need to jumpstart that system again. And that's where the cover crops and the livestock integration come in, push that system with some more carbon. And then again, it will probably plateau out. Because the prairie originally was a steady state system. It had come to an equilibrium place and probably went up and down in carbon based on climate changes, but was there. And so I was really excited about the data because it did show that, somewhere between 8 and 10 years of no-till practices, in the previous figure, where we came up with the 30-pound recommendation increase, to 24 years or 25 years in Sara and Peter's case, we came to that equilibrium. Now, we don't know at what point that was, if it was year 15 or if it was year 18 or what year it was, but we do know that we measured this, Sara and Peter measured that. And so that's pretty neat. You can tell I'm a soil guy because I'm the only one really excited. But
Well, I should clarify too, my comment that it was similar to your data. I guess I was referring to the response. So you can see that the no-till, like Pete said, if you look at the zero, I wasn't doing a very good job of explaining myself, but you can see that the no-till is responding, much like in Anthony's study, they added the extra N, the no-till responded. But basically the difference is here that we didn't need that extra N after the 26 years, essentially. And I think this table is a little confusing with the two arrows, but basically you're looking at 2 planting dates. And so you can see that the response rate, the optimal response is where that arrow hits, and it's about the same, pretty darn close. There's a little difference there, but pretty darn close to the same where we met as far as nitrogen response after all those years at a reasonable rate. If you look down at 50 pounds, of course, there's a difference, but.
And the graph still shows that the tilled plots are mining organic matter. I mean, it clearly shows that because as Peter mentioned, and you just talked about, the no-till curves are steeper at the beginning, indicating the need for that nitrogen to be there from the fertilizer.
There you go. That's what I was trying to say the whole time. Should have just let you say it.
No, that's fine.
Okay.
It's your data.
And I would just for clarity's sake, just focus on the top 2 lines. Forget about the late planting date.
It just gets confusing.
You can see the economic optimum is about the same for those. If you were trying to figure out what's my optimum, it would be the same for the no-till as a conventional till. So, but that's in a mature system. But for starting out, you need extra nitrogen.
You need extra nitrogen.
Just keep this in mind, when you get started. And I did see, while I was bumbling through trying to make a point here, someone did have a question. Brad asks, what are some suggestions for interseeding cover crops into corn around V6? Species, seeding methods, etc. It won't be grazed. I will let someone take that since I have mumbled around enough here.
That's David or Garrett.
A few years ago, I had opportunity to work with this cover crop seed that was coated with, calcium carbonate and some kind of proprietary, water absorbent. And since we had different species coated like that in a different level of coating, So what do I do with a bunch of those, seeds from species? So we tried, hand broadcasting on small plots in several different locations on corn at V6 and at physiological maturity or half milk line, give or take about first week of September. Um, if I have to give you a short answer, that V5, V6 didn't really amount to anything by the time corn was taken out, when the grain was harvested. So that's a short answer. So if I were to go out and put something out, I would rather do later in the season, airplane fly something, like cereal rye, if you're in the corn soybean rotation, maybe mix some, brassica species with it. And if you can catch a rain in that, or some kind of moisture after broadcast seeding, I think that will have more growth uh, than going in. It just shades out after V10, and I think that was the problem. And annual ryegrass has shown some promise, and I think it also does well with some of the herbicide that we spray in corn at that stage of the, in its growth cycle. But other species just shaded out and didn't amount to much. And this was tried in, I would say, more like a I-29 corridor, like north of Watertown, Beresford, Brookings, Aurora, Arlington, multiple locations we've tried in a couple of years. Corn at V6, corn at physiological maturity, small grain after heading out, I would say milk stage, soybean at leaf drop. The only good thing, we could see when you go out in the field, you can sense that, and when you observe, you get this little when you see the actual, plants growing was after small grain, or things that was sprayed at milk stage that's on small grain. And I know Pete has, done similar things, and Geared has to see some, herbicide interaction with these cover crop species. So that was my answer. I don't know if there's any short answer these days with research, but that is my 2 cents.
No, I would agree totally, David, and moisture is really the key factor. Just depends on where you're at and if you get the rain when you need it, and get that started. I'm looking here to see if
Peter
go ahead,
and
Jared.
go ahead, yeah.
I was going to say, go ahead, sorry.
No, go ahead, Peter. Sorry, go ahead.
Well, just to kind of go back to what David and Anthony were saying, we've done some work with broadcasting, and basically my thought there is about half the time it failed. And what happens is if you broadcast seed and you don't get a rain, let's say you go out of V4, V5, V6, you broadcast seed and you don't get a rain, and the corn gets bigger, and say you get a rain 2 weeks later, by then it'll get shaded out. I mean, it may rain, you may get the cover crop to germinate underneath there from what I've seen, but it gets shaded out. So you have to, if you're going to broadcast seed early, you have to get a rain early. So it's kind of a high risk venture. But if you do happen to broadcast seed early and it fits your herbicide program, and you get a rain before the corn really gets, more than knee high, and it gets a start, the annual ryegrass will be there at the end in the fall, but we don't really see that it puts a lot of growth on because it's been shaded by the corn all year. So really, I don't see a lot of potential for that. We've done a little bit of work this last year with varying the row spacing, and we basically lost half a bushel, 5/10 to 6/10 of a bushel of yield for every inch that we placed the rows wider. So we went from 15 to 30 to 45 to 60. And we'll probably repeat that study, but that means if you're going to go from a 30 to a 60-inch row, that data would predict a 15 to 18 bushel per acre yield loss. So if you widen it out so you get more light, you're gonna lose some corn yield. So I think in other situations, in other parts of the country where you have more rainfall and you maybe have a more open fall weather, like if you're in Missouri or Southern Illinois or Kentucky, I think that system might have more potential because if you can get it started early and get your corn off, and then it has time to grow late in the fall. But to me, I have to say we haven't made it work at the Southeast farm. Not to say it can't work, but we haven't been able to do it. What we have been able to do with corn is what David mentioned with winter rye, either fly it in or plant it right after corn harvest. And that's pretty robust. So there's my 2 bits. If you want to have a cover crop and corn, I would start with winter rye, flying it in, early September, or else drilling it in probably better after harvest.
So Peter, we have a question from Austin in the chat, and his comment is about, drilling it in 30-inch rows. And I think you've helped Jason Clark down there at the Southeast Farm do that for a couple of years here, correct?
Yeah, we've done a couple of years of that. We basically don't see a lot of growth on it because the corn shades it. And then if we go with a 105-day corn or 103-day corn, it doesn't really have enough time at the end of the season to put on a lot of growth. So to this point, that's a work in progress. And so we'll see, maybe we'll perfect a way over time. But at this point, I don't see it where it's worked consistently and hasn't hurt corn yield.
If I recall, when I helped David with the broadcast work, is we would get a stand establishment early in corn, and it would be there. We would count the plants, but we would come back in middle of July or in August, and the numbers of plants went down or even disappeared. Do you recall that, David?
Yep. When the corn is small, you broadcast, let's say you catch the rain in a timely manner, you get really excited, you see these plants coming out and looks like a really nice established, plant. There's no space between rows sometimes. And like you said, as season progresses, then you see less and less growth of that plant. And when it actually matters at the end of the season, there's nothing. I mean, very sporadic, plants here and there. But that being said, we tried mung bean. I gotta go back to my mung bean because it was warm season. So, I mean, that fits the cycle. And then we had annual ryegrass, mung bean, maybe some radish or turnip and some other, warm season, some of the other species, but there's no, annual ryegrass did show some promise, it's in some way, because that could be a little more shade tolerant than other species that we used.
And when it grew, it got really long and lanky because the sunlight coming through that corn canopy was very limited. It just didn't perform well. I know Austin has done some work with that, and another producer I know quite well has, and got the plants to grow, and it's the same kind of thing. The radishes grow really long, and they're searching for sunlight, and the cowpeas grew up the corn plants because they're searching for sunlight. So I hope that covers that, Austin. Of course, that all led to the interest in 60-inch corn rows, because I think a lot of people realize that we're not being very successful in the 30s, so let's widen the corn rows so we can grow a cover crop. And I don't know if anybody on the call has tried that or if there's any comments, but I know I've been in several of those fields, and I think they're experiencing limited success with the corn. I know last year they did. Does anybody have a comment about that?
Just to add to what you guys are saying, yeah, I agree with all of you. Shading is definitely the bigger effect on the cover crop than even a herbicide would be. Of course, you want to stay away from some. It'd be easier with weed control, especially if you have water hemp going the annual rye route, because then you can come in with like a Callisto and knock down the water hemp. If you have like a long residual which a lot of people are doing that, or overlapping it in like early posts, you're going to run into issues with, even though turnips, from what I can tell, turnips, radishes are pretty tough, but some other species, cowpea can be knocked down pretty easily by a lot of corn herbicides early on. Of course, you wouldn't want to do anything like sunflower. That'd be just a massacre for sure when it comes to herbicide interactions. But yeah, I'd say if weeds are an issue, I'd stick with singular species, grasses. But if you want to add in like later on, yeah, if you want to fly on something, I think you'll be all right. Well, I can tell you're going to be off label, but you can't graze or hay it, but you can definitely grow it if you can get germinate later on in the season, flying it on or something like that.
And I'd comment that that's another, maybe moving into that topic, that's another issue that gets overlooked. You know, people want to plant multi-species mixes because you spread your risk and there's a lot of benefits, and we could go on and on about that. But if you have a weed problem, or if they get out of control, you have multi-species. There's no herbicide that selects for,
yeah,
like grass and broadleaf, and yeah, we don't have GMO cover crops. So you have to be really mindful of that so that you don't end up trying to graze or clip off, I guess, all your weeds.
I mean, I've seen producers. I've been in fields. I think I was with I can't remember. We're down by Sioux Falls somewhere. We were somewhere. I did some early on drilling through corn, and they did like a half rate of some common pre-emergence, and they got a stand. So I'm not saying it can't be done. It's just a normal herbicide application will hinder you normally in corn, unless it's just a grass species. If you put down like you have to stay away from like dual and zidua, stuff like that's going to hinder your grasses, but you'll probably have nothing come up if you spray that at a full rate. But yeah,
well, and I think
wise.
Yeah, and it lends to the issue of a lot of people that are transitioning into these types of systems are wanting, I mean, honestly, a lot of the sell for me when I'm talking to someone who's going to try this for the first time is that they can use it as a forage. When you're just getting started out, it's often hard to swallow, I'm just going to plant this and leave it there, because you can't feel and hold the money that you may get from it someday, or the benefit that your soils are going to get. And so that's fine if you want to use it as a forage, but keep in mind, if you do something like Garrett just talked about, you're off label and you really can't graze or hay legally, or probably safely. So
any of this, I would start small acreage and then see what works for your place and then move on from there.
I think that's an excellent point, Garrett, because there's a lot of things that can go wrong with establishment, and then weed control. And then like as David and Anthony mentioned, where we've done it with annual ryegrass and we've got it established and it's there. Sometimes it's there at the end of the year. There's not much there because it got shaded all year. So even when you get to the end, if with a full season corn, you don't, unless you have an open fall, it doesn't have a lot of chance to grow. So it's something you want to do on start on a small scale and not because there's a lot of variables to it. And you want to perfect it at that level before you try it on a big scale.
I think, Peter, you used this term several times, bulletproof, and that cereal rye, I've flown that into corn for 3 or 4 years, for 4 years. And I never had a failure. It always was there. And flying that in at physiologically mature corn, it worked. And 1 year, we didn't have any rain, it didn't grow, and there it was in the spring. So, but that, that's a big check to write. That airplane's not cheap, and I don't want to write that check my whole farming career. So I don't know what to do about that. I think David Brandt in Ohio has got a high boy cedar that he goes in with. I had a neighbor try that. He didn't like all the rundown corn, and I can see that you got mature corn and you're running through it and you see those ears on the ground. That's different than seeing a corn plant on the ground, like in June when you're just normally spraying. And so I don't know what the solution is there, but that cereal rye has worked really good. So
I think the Dwayne Becks of the world would say that the solution is to stop planting corn and soybeans, but we have to be realistic with all of you that we know that that's where the market is. So we can change the market, but we all have to do it. And let's face it, that's a very challenging thing. I don't want to be the guinea pig. I'll ask my husband. I'm going to say he's going to say the same thing. But we do have another question here. So David mentioned flying cereal rye into soybeans at leaf drop. Yes, very interesting. Can you elaborate on how that turned out? Even no-till soybean fields in a corn soy rotation can end up with bare soils in the fall and over the winter. Good point.
Yeah, I must have misspoke. We had, when I said soybean at leaf drop, I meant those coated cover crop seed, mixes of cool season species that we tried in soybean at leaf drop. I mean, we haven't tried cereal rye on soybean stubble or soybean crop. I must have misspoken. We have always, at least some of the projects that I'm involved in, we've always tried on corn, cereal rye flying into corn, not into beans. And we are trying to find something that can go into soybean or after soybean, and that's something we haven't been able to do successfully with any species. Last year, we have put in some winter camelina on soybean ground, and we have to just wait and watch how it turns out this year in the spring. But soils were pretty dry, and it wasn't a fun planting because the seeds were so small, and so we have to wait and see, how they, if they turn out, how they turn out. I mean, this year. But we haven't tried any cereal rye into soybeans, and rotationally it fits better after corn.
if Peter can remember well, we tried this at Almiron's place. We flew into soybeans. Do you remember that, Peter?
Yeah, I remember that.
We did different rates of cereal rye.
Yeah, it came out pretty good. I would say the thing you want to manage there is corn doesn't like to get planted into green rye very much. And so you'll take a yield hit. And now some people say if you put enough extra nitrogen, like extra 40 or 50 pounds of nitrogen on, you can avoid that. But I would say if you're going to plant rye after soybeans go into corn, you probably want to kill the rye, a couple weeks before you plant. And you might want to make sure you have a bit of some nitrogen in furrow if you can, a little bit, or off to the side. So your nitrogen management is going to be more critical if you've got a rye cover crop and you're planting corn. Planting soybeans into a rye cover crop is very much more forgiving situation, and because the soybeans fix their own nitrogen and they don't seem to be affected by the rye that as much. So we've had a really good luck going with rye after corn into soybeans. And now I know people in Nebraska that say they plant corn into rye and they have good luck with it, but they're putting on quite a bit of extra nitrogen, I believe. So that's another one. If you were going to plant rye and after corn into soybeans, I would say you could probably do that on a fairly decent scale. You want to plant, you want to probably just take the residue managers off your planter so they don't wrap up and manage the, kill the rye in a, either when it's short or after you plant. If you're going to plant corn into rye, I would kill the rye a couple of weeks early. And then if you want to do it on the plant corn into green rye, I'd do that on a small scale till you figure it out, because it's easy to lose 20 bushel an acre planting corn into green rye.
And there's a comment I think we only panelists can see. Emmanuel just put in a note that planting corn in green rye has shown to cause severe corn pythium root rot in Iowa.
Yeah. So
there are
planting
some
corn
root diseases in corn.
So planting, so back to the original question, rye after soybeans ahead of corn, there's problems there. So you want to do that on a small scale till you figure it out.
Another thing is that rye has any height at all. When you combine the soybeans, you're going to be clipping that rye off and it just have to regrow. But we also had field peas in that study, Peter. And they got, 5 or 6 inches tall. And when Al combined his soybeans, he cut them off and then they didn't grow back. So it was kind of an experiment. So we kind of learned some few things there. So there's
sorry, go ahead.
No, Garrett, I think you're going to cover what I was going to say.
Yeah, I think Darren, you have a question about cover crop and about herbicide being off label, et cetera, and grazing. Yeah, I'm going to talk a little bit about it tomorrow. But yeah, so if you're on tomorrow, we can talk more about that tomorrow as well. And I was going to also mention, just with our experience, me, Anthony Bly, and David Karki, we've been doing some research. I'll talk about that tomorrow. Cover crops after corn silage, and even up Brown County, we've had good stands of rye, of everything else, of course, winter killed that we put in there, but rye definitely looked good in the fall, and then it survived Brown County winters just fine. In the spring, it looked really good. Even dry areas, we were out in Falk County, and it looked amazing. By May, before planting, it was up to I'm tall, I'm 6'5", and it was up to my waist already by like mid-May. So we had some good stands, and we had a whole lot less weed issues, and that's a kochia area, and there's no kochia in that stand of rye. But if you go right outside of that rye, there's definitely kochia. Again, that's if you have silage. And there's a lot of silage cut in that area, so we had some good, I think, teaching abilities in that area. But yeah, so that's just depends on your area and what you're planning on doing. So in those areas, we just burned it down, and we had no problems planting. I would again suggest burning it down earlier than later, depends on moisture. But yeah, to get beans into rye planted in the spring, I think it's not an issue, and I think it's going to help you out, not hinder you if controlled properly.
That's a good point, Garrett, because we've seen where we've had really dry year, like in 2012, if we let the rye grow longer, it used up residual moisture. Of course, 2012, we hope we don't have another year like that. But you can get a situation where if you're in a drought, you want to kill the rye early rather than let it use moisture. By early, I'm thinking early May.
Yeah, and if it's tending to be really dry, and it was dry, and we don't have a lot of soil moisture stored up, we might want to think killing it even earlier than that. So this could be the year. So who knows? Could start raining any day too. Well, do we have any more questions? I don't see any more questions. It is 10:50. Is it time to kind of transition into a different portion of this? What do you think, panelists?
Looks like, a question just popped up. I was going to say by 11 o'clock, we could probably give them the code, but
okay,
you have to wait a little longer. So Brad's asking, when planting soybeans into standing rye, do you terminate with glyphosate only? Good question. Or do you add a residual herbicide? I know some growers have hesitation about the residuals not hitting the soil. Maybe Garrett wants to talk about that?
I think Pete, at the farm, you have always used glyphosate only, right? Or maybe you added something else.
We've done it both ways, but we haven't. Usually, the rye helps with weed control, like Garrett said, and we haven't had problems where we had poor weed control because we used rye. I'd say the opposite. We tend to have fewer weed problems, but this kind of Garrett's specialty. So.
And rye tends to, what I've seen and read about is rye tends to be killed pretty easily just by glyphosate only if needed.
Yeah, glyphosate's great on rye. And also, so when rye starts breaking down, from research I've seen, it's kind of not understand real well, but it's called allelopathy. So when the chemicals in rye, as it breaks down, actually hinders germination of weeds. So when you kill it, if there's enough there to break down, it can actually be a pre-emergent in a sense. But I wouldn't be too concerned. It depends on your rye, I guess, how thick it is about hitting the ground. I mean, you need water anyways to get it activated. So the water's going to wash it off the rye and it's going to get the soil. Yeah, will some of it be bound up in the rye? Potentially, just like any organic matter. But I would say, yeah, I kind of have to play around with that. But I think a full rate of a pre, if you're doing that normally and then burn down the rye at the same time, I think it'd be fine. I've seen no issues with that.
And
He
there is
kind of
another,
threw in there.
go ahead, Sarah.
I was just going to say, he threw in, Garrett,
Oh,
asking
oh.
if the terminated
Oh.
rye replaces the need for the residual.
That's
Sort
a
of.
million-dollar question.
That's
That's a good question.
Well, for flowing in rye on corn, you won't get a solid stand across your field. That's been my experience.
It's not
And
like
so you're
So
going to need,
spotty.
yeah, you're going to need your residual in those areas that you don't have your full stand. Now that's flowing in broadcast rye. You know, if you drill in cereal rye and get a nice even stand, then I'm tempted to leave out the residual, but I never have. So don't go by me. But that might be a case where you do some experimenting. I mean, that's what it's all about, and leave a strip without any pre and see what happens. You know.
Yeah, Brad, there's a lot of factors there. I can't give you a definite
Says
yes.
he
by
wants
any
a definite yes. Yeah.
Like if you go into a rye field that just rye, just somebody drilled in normally, I mean, the areas where the drill doesn't get to, if there's nothing to spray there, you're going to see weed pressure. Because weeds, just as if you're on Dwayne's talk, I mean, weeds like to go in areas where there's no competition. So less competition, you're going to see still a weed pressure. And rye's not going to be a heavy hitter.
We've seen it with a little bit of work we've done in organic systems with rye as a cover crop, and then knock it down and seed beans into it. And we don't have much weed pressure where the rye residue is thick, but anywhere where, you know, the residue got windrowed a little bit through the traffic, anywhere where there's a gap in the stand, the weeds came. So go back kind of to Anthony's point, that it depends. If you got a heavy stand and you got plenty of residue, you might leave a strip out and see if you get away, you know, what it looks like. But if you've got a thin stand of rye, or if the rye was killed early, I wouldn't plan on getting so much weed suppression from it.
So we've got a bunch of questions rolling in here.
Yep.
Who wants to do them? Sarah, want to sort through them, or what do you want to do?
Sure, I can sort through them. Darren's asking, so he planted rye for a cash crop, and he's concerned about winter kill because of little to no snow cover. Rye is somewhat tough compared to some of our other small grains. I'd start off by saying that, Darren. It's always hard to know. But if it germinated and you saw it come up, that's going to help things, of course, to have some root stores there. But it's really hard to say with, the cold temps we had. I'm not sure where you're at. It depends on how long they lasted for you. I mean, it could cause some issues, but we didn't have icing and rains. There shouldn't have been an oxygen issue there. It's just how cold it got. And that is a good question. I don't know if anyone else on the panel has some experience with rye winter kill beyond, the little bit of cover crop that work I've done with it. But rye is fairly tough. I would hope that would help, keep your stand, but certainly can't guarantee it.
Peter,
Anyone
any
else?
comments?
Winter rye is the toughest winter cereal you've got, so there's not a stronger option out there. That is the strongest one for being able to survive winter. And we haven't seen it winter kill. I see Paul Johnson just made a note that he hadn't seen it winter kill. I haven't seen it winter kill.
Oh, yeah.
But what
No,
I
haven't either.
Is it doesn't like wet feet. So
Mhm.
if you get wet ground or you get late fall rains, or worse yet, winter rains, and you get standing water, then that'll hurt the rye. But just outright cold temperature, I haven't seen that hurt it.
I've had people refute me when I've said rye is the toughest cereal, so I'm always afraid to say that. So Peter said it, but it's
Yeah.
true. It's really the toughest one we've seen in South Dakota. Tara's asking, what rate are you flying the rye into the mature corn? Maybe Anthony or Peter, you guys have done some work with that.
About 40 pounds.
Or there you
That's
go,
what I've
David,
tried. Yeah.
Yeah, we've
Just for a cover crop.
experimented. I've gone down to 30. Airplanes don't want to carry, well, they don't want to make a lot of trips back and forth. So yeah, there's a happy medium in there, and I'm happy with 40. Now, if you're in a grazing system, you might want to go a little bit heavier. But if 40 fills in, 40 can fill in pretty good. Yeah.
I always tell people kind of a forage rate.
Yeah. I was just going to say, as a cover crop, I think 35, 40 pounds, like David and Anthony said, is good. If you're really gung-ho that you want to get the weed suppression out of it, that's your goal, then I would crank it up. If you want to get a heavy stand to suppress weeds.
Or you want a lot of grazing availability,
Yeah, you might go to 70 or 80 pounds, but you're going to pay extra for that.
Yeah.
The one other thing I would just say, for benefit of people that might be closer to an airport or an aerial applicator, I think the cost for this is going to vary a lot based on your proximity to an airport. So if you're close to an aerial applicator, your cost might be more reasonable. You might be more of an option for you to consider. If you're further away, it's going to cost you more to get the service done. I
found that the length of the runway matters, and that the airplanes, the air tractor or whatever, their specific airplanes can carry so much weight, and they need a longer runway to take off if they're full. And so if they're using a local runway, it might not be long enough, and they'll have to limit their amount of weight they put in there. But if they can fly out of a concrete runway or a long FAA more approved runway, they can load it up and go, stuff it full. So
anyway, my point there is you probably want to talk to your aerial applicator, because I visited with a little bit, and the answer to me was it depends on where you are in proximity to the airport. So it's not going to be the same answer for everybody.
Right.
And I think most of our producers that are broadcasting rye are doing it for soil health benefits, probably more so than grazing. But if you're trying to get a forage rate out there or knock some weeds down, it could be a problem to broadcast it thick enough. We do have some more questions, but I'm thinking since it's 11 o'clock, maybe we'll let Anthony share the QR code, and we'll stay on here. We will let Matt transfer over to our informal discussion period now. So we'll continue answering questions and talking with you, but he will probably work towards getting people moved onto the panel so you can ask questions verbally if you'd like to in a more informal setting. Going back up in the chat here, I'll try to redeem myself from my mumbling around earlier, make sure I don't miss anything. Okay, there's a question about crimping rye. This tends to come up. I guess I'll start and then others can chime in. I know there are some producers, especially Western South Dakota, less of a row crop system, where they do have some success with, you need to get rye fairly mature to crimp it. It needs to have a head on before you can really have success with killing it typically. But the issue with crimping rye in South Dakota is getting it to maturity to get to that point. It's having the time. We don't typically have the time to get it to that point in our row cropping systems. So a lot of times it doesn't even get that far, but I will let others chime in on that.
Yep, you're right, Sarah. It's a time, and then the time at the growth stage. For most of the plants, later in the growth stage, it gets better kill with any kind of external disturbance. Does that make sense? Wind or any kind of external forces will kill the plants that are later in the growth stage easily than the plants that are earlier in the growth stage. And then we don't have seasonal window for rye to grow that fast to jointing or heading to that point that can be easily terminated just by crimping. We don't want them to come back. That's the issue. Right, Pete? Do you have any thoughts?
Yeah, basically, if you crimp it before it flowers, it can grow back. At that point, you'll have to use a chemical to kill it. If you crimp it when it's flowering, or if you mow it after it flowering, then it'll be dead. It won't come back. And the limitation I see is, for the rye takes a little longer to flower. Generally, it's open pollinated. So it's the flowering period lasts a little, week or so. It's not as quick as wheat to go through pollination. And then by the time you get to that point, you're somewhere in early June probably. And now if you're in a moisture limited situation, it could be tough. If you got plenty of moisture, I think you could get a nice crop of beans into that. So to me, my way of looking at it is it's soil moisture is the limiting factor there. And you can't do it early, because if you say, oh, I'm going to crimp the rye early and get I've got good moisture and get a good stand, the rye will grow back. If you wait for the rye to flower and crimp it, you'll kill the rye, but by then you're into June. And now if you have a dry June, you could be in a tough situation.
Especially if you're going to come back and plant soybeans.
That's the issue.
Yeah. And I think if you've got moisture, we've done a little bit of that. And if you've got moisture, if you catch good rains, we've got a nice bean crop out of it. But, if you don't have the moisture, then it's not a good situation.
We've got some more questions here. So Eric is asking in the chat if anyone has an experience with fava bean as a cover crop. I know that's gained a little bit more popularity and availability, at least in South Dakota. Sounds like it's cold tolerant and competitive in a mix. I know I've seen it be pretty competitive. I don't know, Anthony and David, was there fava bean in the study that just completed? I'm not sure if I don't
not
recall.
As a cover crop, but just as a cash crop, just to
Okay.
try to see if it grows in our environment here at the Northeast Farm, north of Watertown. Planted early in the spring, like you would do any other small grain, and extremely limited, success because of the weeds took over. And I can't remember why that year we couldn't go out and spray anything, or we didn't find the herbicide, but I think there's no herbicide label for it, and weed was the issue. And at that time I wasn't trying for cover crop. I was just trying how it grows in our environment, and couldn't get anything out of it.
It's a warm season plant, correct, David?
I think it is a cool season plant that you can go really early in the spring.
Okay.
Yeah, I think it's kind of commonly, I've learned that misconception, because it's a bean, it just sounds like it should be warm season, I think, because I always thought that too. But if you look it up, he's right. It's pretty cold tolerant, I think.
It is.
It's ratings
okay.
anyway. Yeah. Peter, have you planted any fava bean at the Southeast Farm?
Not much, no. It is.
Okay.
I do know from the literature it's a cool season. I think it's raised in Northern Europe, a large seed size. We did plant some, like David mentioned, but more as a potential grain crop, and we had some disease issues, and it was long enough ago that I don't remember exactly what happened, but so I can't say too much about it. Other than it's
so
adapted
Eric,
to
it sounds
cold
like
weather.
it's a good question that nobody for sure knows the answer to. We might have to collaborate and check it out.
Well, we have to put it in. It has to fit in somewhere. That's the issue.
And usually we just don't have a lot of warm season options, and we've got some good cool season options, but it would be a broadleaf, and that would help. We don't have a lot of cool season broadleaves. So,
more questions.
So, yes, there's one in the Q&A from Darren. And this is a good question, Darren. common. How successful would a cover crop be planted right after soybean harvest? How late maturity can you be successful? What would be the ideal mix? What if we just say it depends? I don't know who wants to tackle that. I've talked enough.
Oh, yeah, I don't think we have really cracked the nut for, for something to follow soybeans. And that's when I, earlier mentioned that we're still trying to look for any species that could do well after beans and then, supports corn without any detrimental effects down the road, because rye is not fitting well after beans, and we're trying to find that other species, and we haven't been able to. That's when I mentioned about the winter camelina. So, I have put in the winter camelina last fall on soybean stubble at the Northeast farm right now, and it was pretty dry when we planted. So hoping to get something out of it this spring, and since it's a brassica species, and a broadleaf, so we're hoping that it won't have any of the problem that rye has, when we follow it corn. So that's the hope. Any other comment? So that's what and we're all looking for that, for that mix or some species that could really do well, especially in corn soybean rotation following soybean.
Now, I haven't had any experience planting sunflowers into cereal rye. So if you're growing soybeans and you planted cereal rye, could you come back with another broadleaf crop after that and be successful?
Your herbicides are probably your limiting factor.
Could be, yeah. You have to look at your rotation restrictions for sure. Yeah. But if you had Liberty Link soybeans or something like that.
Yeah, if you didn't put anything else on.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
No, it's a good question, and it's a tough answer. That's like the $300,000 question with cover crops in South Dakota.
Not
and again,
advocating
I think
soybeans on soybeans, but I mean, if you put that cereal rye in there and grew that biomass, grew that carbon, you might be able to come back with soybeans again. And we don't know how that breaks the pest cycles. So, will we have some of them soybean pests carry on? Because we know soybeans on soybeans is detrimental to yield mainly because of those pest cycles. And we don't know if that cereal rye would break that or not. We don't know that. So. Yeah.
And there are a couple of really great comments from Jim Miller. So it's more like a comment than question. So in 2020 prevent plant fields, when soil was sampled, in the top 2 feet, he had found 80 to 120 pounds of nitrogen on top in top 2 feet in those PP fields. And also when those PP fields were grown with cover crops last year, has shown only about 10 pounds of nitrogen in top 2 feet.
80 plus pounds of N in the cover crop. Yeah.
Yeah.
The cover crop is capturing it.
Yep. Catch and release type thing. So yeah. So good comment, Jim.
He's talking about the 20-to-1 CN ratio. There's a lot to that, and that's just a really good testament of what cover crops are doing. Aside from the visual erosion effects, there's a lot of nutrient capture there.
And there's a good question also at the end. I didn't see the question part. How much N will be available for 2021 corn from those?
Thanks,
so
Jim.
That's for Anthony.
Anthony, that's yours. Anthony, you answer that.
Yeah, thanks a lot, Jim. I think we've talked about this a little bit, but let me look at here. Okay, you gave, what is the C to N ratio of the cover crop? 20 to 1. We should, we should see some release from that. If we're going for corn, long season crop, we should get some release from that. That being said, we've conducted a lot of corn studies with cover crops, and we did the broadleaf and the grass, and the graduate students working on the data right now. I don't want to steal any of those summaries from him, but I can tell you is we're not seeing the contribution from the cover crop like we think we would. That's kind of a downer, because we all expected that that, that broadleaf, that narrow carbon to nitrogen ratio would contribute something. But those curves for the nitrogen rate curves are all coming out about the same. And he's got 18 site years of data in there, and it's kind of disappointing. So that's why I mentioned, the C to N ratio. We've got to apply that to our cover crop mixes. We haven't done that yet, but that's something we want to do. But that's pretty narrow. I would be willing to bet, and not a lot, but we should get something released out of that narrow of a C to N ratio. How much? Maybe we bank on half. Peter, are you agreeing or disagreeing with me on that?
I was going to say I would figure half, unless your cover crop is really high residue, so a lot of fiber, in which case it might tie up a little more of it. But I think if your cover crop is mostly brassicas and broadleafs or legumes that are going to, broadleafs they're going to break down rapidly, I would figure half of it. That would be my assessment.
And you have seen, Pete, about 8 to 10 bushel, yield advantage in corn, right? After
if we have a cool season broadleaf cover crop, especially radishes, we usually pick up about 8 or 10 bushel per acre afterwards. If we have a grass-based cover crop mix, that makes better forage, but the corn doesn't yield any better. So we don't see, this is what we've done at Southeast Farm. If we have a radish brassica based mix, we do see on the order of 10 bushel per acre benefit at Beersford.
Jim's talking about no-tilling into that prevent plant cover crop, I would assume too, right, guys?
Say that again, Eric.
Is Jim Miller's question, he's going to no-till into that prevent plant cover crop? It's not a tilled under cover crop, right?
I was assuming that, but Jim, you can pipe in.
I think it is, but again, Jim would have to. We got a couple other questions in there too.
Yeah, I was just looking up, somebody was typing to me. Jim Finnegan has a good question here. Is that what you were looking at, Anthony? He's talking about transitioning, and go ahead.
No, go ahead. Sorry.
He's talking about transitioning. I was just reading it. This is a good question because I was just working with a couple growers on this, trying to help them. So transitioning from a tillage system to a no-till system with a new rotation, sometimes your crops will double up. And he's basically saying, for example, just this one time, he's going to have corn. Say you're doing a corn soy tillage rotation, you're changing to a corn small grain soybean rotation, and you end up with corn back to back. What are some cover crops you could throw in there? So I guess my 2 cents would be, like, if it's a corn on corn for 2 years, you would want probably a broadleaf in there. And if you're harvesting for grain, it doesn't leave you a lot of time, but maybe you could use brassicas. That would be an inexpensive, probably, method there, or like a brassica mix or some kind of cool season broadleaf mix in there. I wouldn't go cereal rye personally, just because you're adding more grass, but that would at least help break up that grass rotation. Of course, there's other crops that could go back to back too. Soybean on soybean would be maybe a little tougher unless you're willing to put in a winter crop like cereal rye. But if you're looking for more specifics, Jim, you can sure chime in, and I'm sure others have opinions on that too.
Yeah,
or if I'm saying something off color.
Yeah, no, that's fine, Sarah. I'm glad you took that on. The corn on corn.
There's a lot of options.
The corn on corn is, Dwayne is part of Dwayne's main rotation that he talks about, and that's an established no-till situation, and this would be a transition. Nitrogen is important there, but it's not. It's not going to fix the whole problem. So I think having a readily available source of nitrogen at the beginning of the season is probably important in that corn on corn. because it is such a high carbon to nitrogen ratio. So there is, net immobilization of nitrogen in some cases with that corn residue. So I think that is an issue if you want to see that corn get off to an early start and look good all season. Maybe that's what you look at. I would pay attention to your soil phosphorus levels too. If you're in that low and very low category, banding is really the way to go too. So
you maybe don't want brassicas if you're in the low soil phosphorus level. That would affect things too. But
yeah,
I was just thinking an inexpensive, simple way to do that, but you need to look at more than just the expense.
Yeah, I don't know if that covers it, but not a lot of room in there when you end corn and you want to start corn. So I haven't, anybody flowing clovers into corn. I'm sure there's a herbicide issue there as well. And
I just read something. It was in the Northeast that they did it, but it seems like with clover, the stand is tough. If you clip it, it always comes back nice, but hard to get it going. Yeah. And that's, clover would be tough. It's late in the season, but that's a tough one. More questions.
I think you're going to have a hard time fitting something between two corn crops that are full maturity. Yeah. If you're cutting one for silage, then that opens you more of a window. But if you want to have cover crops, then, if you double up on your soybeans, you would have the winter rye as an option. That would be pretty clear.
Yeah. That, like I said, that's the only thing I've ever seen go behind is brassicas behind corn and grow and do something. Just depends on the year. And then you're taking up moisture there too. So kind of depends. Depends on if you're willing to take the risk. What soil fertility levels are recommended for a full season diverse cover crop mix intended? We always get these good questions. Intended for late season or winter grazing and to minimize nitrate issues in general. We did have, David and Anthony and I wrote an article, and we did have some very general blanketed suggestions. And I want to say, Anthony, it was like 30 to 40 pounds. Correct me if I'm wrong, but that is like extremely general because it really depends on what you're planting in that mix. And if you want to graze it, I often tell people you should put some nitrogen down if you really want some good grazing potential, but you need to be careful if it gets dry for nitrates. And of course, there's a few plants that you need to watch for sulfates and other things, but I'll let Anthony add to that. I want to say it was 30 to 40 pounds was kind of our blanketed suggestion, depending on what you're planting.
Yeah, just something to kick it up there. I mean, if you've got a lot of legumes in there, you're gonna, discourage nodulation if you put on too much nitrogen. But if you've got a lot of sorghum sedans and millets, a lot of high end use crops in there, then you're going to want a little bit more nitrogen on. I recall Dan Forgy, I think he put just 100 pounds of urea on his full season cover crop. He had some comparisons too, so don't hang your hat on what I'm saying, but something in there to get that going and produce some biomass, because that's your objective is to, we grow corn, we want 200 and some bushels. You grow a full season cover crop, you want
leaves.
You want 10, 12, 14 tons of biomass, right? So those nutrients got to come from somewhere. And the
nitrate issues that he's mentioning, I don't know how to phrase that. So of course you can always have nitrate issues, but it's really more of an issue when it gets dry. Is that a safe way to say that, Anthony?
Absolutely. I mean, that nitrate gets trapped in the bottom part of the plant. It can't convert because the plant is not developing because of the drought. And so we get high nitrates, and they usually occur in the bottom foot of the stalk, especially on sorghum, sedan, and corn. It's always down there. And
we proved that in 2012 We
Yes.
chopped all of our plots for silage by hand. But the one thing I'm not a livestock expert, I will start by saying that. But one thing to remember is the cow doesn't typically go and bite the bottom of the plant off. They're going to start at the top. So you have to be really careful not to overgraze in those situations. You can always get a test done and find out and kind of get an idea too of where that nitrate is in the plant if it's a dry year. And then I'm not going to suggest you do or don't graze. It totally depends on the year. But keep in mind that, you know, the animal's going to start from the best part and go down. So they're not going to eat that bottom of the stalk first. You just have to really watch if you think it's an issue.
So I was in the lab in Sioux Falls in 2012, and I ran a lot of nitrates. And it was more than 300, but less than 500 samples. And there was less than a dozen that I got on the phone and called right away because the nitrates were so over the top that, you know, we just wanted to make sure that the personal communication got to the person and that we thought it was a serious issue. So, I mean, it's a funny how it happens. Yeah.
If it's an extremely dry year, don't get me wrong, I'm not suggesting you just throw them out there. Just if it's a concern and you see high nitrates in the bottom 6 inches, you know, you definitely want to talk to a livestock nutritionist, but there may be opportunity to graze the top of the plant. I guess that's all I was getting at. But yeah, 2012, a year like that, you really need to be careful. And we never know when we fertilize what's going to happen. That's the trouble.
So Darren's got a great question there. That's the epitome of what we're trying to accomplish today. You want to read it, Sara? Or?
Sure. Going from a tillage system and corn soybean rotations, what are key concerns for someone jumping in the deep end head first with no-till cover crops and more diverse crop rotation? First of all, they're brave. Good for them. But we usually kind of try to ease people into it for more than one reason. But if you're really going to jump in head first, I think you need to have some goals set out for what to focus on first. And maybe, Anthony, you kind of headed up that publication. Maybe you want to talk to that. That's kind of what we talked about in our publication.
Yeah, you know, we wanted to create something for those just transitioning, and it's more than just the tillage. And Peter and David and Garrett, if you want to jump in too, please. It's more than just the tillage. So I'm glad you mentioned cover crops, and I'm glad you mentioned a diverse rotation because they're key parts to that transition. And Sara's mention of goals is there as well. And if you consider all these things, I think the transition will be much more quick, maybe less painful. It's going to take a lot more management than just corn and soybeans. Those were, well-known programs. We know how to do that really well. But when you transition and you add crops and cover crops, now you got to think about cool and warm season species. And that third crop, what's it going to be, and where might, how will you use it or sell it? I think those are all things that you're going to have to focus on, but focus on the planter. The seeding equipment is your main field operation. Of course, controlling weeds with the sprayer isn't really going to change that much from a conventional setting. The weed species will change, but how you do it won't change. You maybe have to change some, I don't know if herbicide selections will have to change that much. Garrett's on here. I know the weed spectrums change a little bit, going from conventional tilled soil to no-till. You go more into the winter annuals, if you will, than the sunflowers and the cocklebur and things like that. The small seeds stick with you. The lamb's quarters, the pigweed, the water hemp, they'll all stick with the system change. But Dr. Beck, Dwayne's comments about opportunities, and if we give gaps and we leave open gaps, our pests take those opportunities. And I've learned a lot lot from him, and hope I can convey it to other people. Hope everyone can, but so that's where that's at. And so to get back, the planter, look for someone in your neighborhood that's doing it, and see how they're doing it, and then modify your planter. And we talk about down pressure being important. Too much can be detrimental. Learn how to adjust the down pressure. Sidewall compaction is mentioned in that article. Learn how to take that out. We didn't have a lot of options back in the 90s. We just didn't even have the internet to look at. So we had to learn as we go. But now there's like 50 companies marketing some sort of furrow closing device. Try to get the one that works in your soil type, because a lot of these, Dr. Paul Yassa, engineer in Nebraska, talks about that the manufacturer of the attachment is usually suited for the soil type in their area, right? They had a problem, so they manufactured something, and that's where it came from. So try to find out which soil types these manufactured items come from, because some work better in high clay soils, some work better in sandy soils. If you have loamy soils, you're probably in the driver's seat, because it seems like that's the middle of the ground, and pretty much everything works well there. But all those things, so you're changing your mindset from preparing the soil for planting to going out and planting and getting it done right in a different environment. And it can be done. It's very doable.
He mentioned he's going to graze as well. And that's probably just adding to the benefit, Darren, of, there's some serious benefits of having that nutrient cycling. And if you end up with weed issues in your cover crops, it's a good way, unless it's thistles or something like that, but that can help too, just to keep things under control.
Yeah, well, hope we did that one justice. I don't know.
No,
Peter?
that's the culmination of, the document and the whole discussion.
Yeah, I would just throw in there, you might see a bit of a shift towards winter annual weeds, so you want to scout those. And Anthony mentioned you're going to need more nitrogen. Check your planter, and we've planted a little deeper over time with our corn, like we go probably about 2.5 inches deep. And you want to have you don't have too much down pressure, but you want to make sure you got enough that you're getting the seed where you want it. And that's just a matter of checking it as you go. So I would just reiterate that what Anthony said. And if you start and then go back and check and make sure it's doing what you want it to do, that's critical to make sure you get your settings. Just common sense stuff. And then your combine, if your combine's not evenly distributing residue, that can be an issue. So with a tilled system, that's more forgiving, but in a no-till system, you want to make sure you get your residue distributed well. So those are the things that come to my mind. Your planter, get your combine so you get your residue distributed well. You're going to need more nitrogen on your corn, and you might have winter annual weeds come up, and it's not an issue as long as you're awake and aware of it. You can control them. You might just got to be cognizant that could happen.
And of course, your herbicide carryover. Do watch that.
Yeah, and we've seen in general, we get over in the long run, we get somewhere around 2 bushel an acre better soybean yield when a no-till, when we compare till to no-till. And the way the corn, we're getting about 5 or 6 bushel less in no-till with corn, the way we manage it. But I think we could then manage better as far as controlled traffic and things go. So I think you'll probably see your soybeans do as well or better. And then you want to manage your corn well so that you don't, you get the extra nitrogen on it and you get the seed where you want it. And then I think you'll be all right.
A good seed firmer is critical. There is a book, The Steps of Placing Seed in a No-Till System, and it's cutting the residue, it's making the furrow to a consistent depth, it's placing the seed in that furrow at a consistent depth, and then it's closing that furrow. And closing a furrow in no-till is different than in conventional till. In conventional till, you have smooth wheels, smooth tires, pressing the soil on the seed. In no-till, that seed firmer is what is so critical in putting the seed in the bottom of the trench. So you want to press that seed in the bottom of that trench, and then we want to get rid of that seed bee, because we showed the picture of the mistake that we made on the Bly farm with the sidewall compaction. There's a number of attachments that crumble that back there. We've even drug a chain sometimes to just put in loose soil over the top of that seed. And that's all you need, is to cover that, keep that seed zone from drying out. So those are the steps of no-till seeding. And so you got to get that in your mind, because it's different than the conventional process. So just want to add that in there.
I'm glad you brought that up, Anthony, because I think that's a huge, like we talked about earlier, planter settings. It's a huge thing. It's really important in no-till, and the details you went through are great. Yesterday I was at virtually, the world of virtual, right, at a forage conference, and the speaker was talking about how he preferred conventionally tilling alfalfa, and that's his choice, whatever, because alfalfa is very picky with the seed bed, as most of you I'm sure know, and it can't be planted very deep. But in my mind, I'm thinking, if you just set the drill right, if you set it properly, it can be done. I've seen it done successfully. But something like that, where you're working with a very tiny seed, it's oh so important. And I think a lot of people get frustrated and maybe give up, or they do it once and they didn't have the settings right, and they give up. But I've stopped people I've worked with and farmed with and said, we got to adjust this drill, and you can see the place, where it was adjusted. It really depends on those planter settings. There is a comment here. Oh, go ahead, Pete.
I would just throw one more thing out, Sarah, and that is just to be aware, when you're making that transition, the biology is going through a succession process. And so it's just like if you quit tilling your field and it went back to prairie, or if you were further east of us and it went back to woods, to a forest, it wouldn't achieve that right away. You wouldn't come back the next year in Wisconsin and have a forest, or you wouldn't come back the next year in western South Dakota and have a mature prairie. It takes time. So there is a succession process or a development process for the soil biology. And so it's going to be toughest at the beginning, and then as it matures, it'll get more and more of those things will work in your favor, and you'll have better soil structure. So the first couple, 2-3 years are going to be the toughest to get through, and it should improve. I don't know, Anthony, you want any thoughts on that? It's not going to, the problems you meet and you encounter in the second year may not be there in the 5th year, I guess is what I'm trying to say, because it's going to work in your favor over time.
You could get lucky, and the environment, the climate will be your friend when you're transitioning, or it could be the worst thing on the planet. We transitioned in the 90s when the rainfall was ramping up. In fact, the whole farm was under no-till in 93, and that was a really high precip year. For those that can't remember that, the Mississippi River flooded all the way to Louisiana, and we had slots open, but it was wet. So what if the slots were open? The corn grew. It wasn't pretty, but we survived. And so we know there's a lot of successful no-tillers out there that know how to solve that problem now. We don't have to relive that. So yes, you could get lucky and you have just perfect weather in that 3 or 4 year stretch when you're transitioning, or it could be, might not be. And if you have the cattle out there, you might have a lot of compaction when you're transitioning. And so the goal is to eventually get to a point where the soil gets stronger, and then those cattle don't make such a big impact anymore. and then life's really good. Okay. And it gets better and better and better. And, you know, by the 15th year, you're really liking it. And then by the 30th year, you're going, wow, this is awesome stuff. And that's why it's so generational. Sarah's comment about a plan and objectives, and you know, this is to keep the family farm running and keep the farm in the family and things like that, or whatever the succession is. But that's the point. It just keeps getting better, and then you can go through droughts a little better. You can go through floods a little better or a lot better, and you know, the stress level goes down too. So find a mentor. Soil Health Coalition has a mentor book along with NRCS. There's people that have volunteered in that book to help. And so in your area, there may be someone in that book that's willing to, you know, let them give you a call. And
I think is that book online now? I'll try to find a link and put that in the chat.
Okay.
I'm not sure. I think it's online. And Anthony, what was the name of the book? Darren was wondering already.
And I'm not endorsing this company, but the one that I know of, the Matt Hange, he's gone now. He had an accident and was killed tragically a few years back. But Matt Hange, Hangy, I believe that's the correct spelling. If Jim Snyder's on the call, he can correct me. Matt was from Gettysburg, and he ended up in Kansas as a no-till consultant, if you will, and started a company and published the no-till seeding steps. And Dwayne talks about this. I've heard Dwayne talk about this in his earlier years. So if you can, it's Exapta. Exapta is the company, and they may still have that steps to no-till seeding on their website. So I would Exapta is EXAPTA, Exapta, and Matt Hange. So that would be a good yes, there you go, spelled correctly, Darren. Or no, Sarah spelled that. So yeah, we should resurrect that and publish that as an extension publication, but you know, that's how it goes. So I've heard Dr. Yasa talk about that from the University of Nebraska too. So it's well known. It's nobody owns that, you know, those ideas. But so Paul Yasa, Jasa is his last name, and he's
a wealth of knowledge on any type of planter settings, etc.
Yep.
I don't know how close he is to retirement either, but
probably pretty close. Yep, there's his name.
Yeah, but I use him. I'm just looking here. Maybe Austin can help me if I can't find it. The building connections, basically mentor booklet and guide. I'm not sure.
Hey,
yeah.
Sarah.
Yep.
I'm pretty sure they need to pick them up at the NRCS office or to just call and request them, because I don't think it's out there for the public.
I wasn't sure because it has people's contact info.
Right.
But if you go to the Soil Health Coalition website, it talks about the mentor network and has, I think, resources. So I'll just throw that link in here. And I think it's probably on the No-Till Association page too.
Yep, we'd be happy to mail them out. And there's pretty much at least one person in every county.
Great, thanks, Austin.
This is going back a step, but when both Peter and Anthony were talking about how as time goes on, things just improve, you know, that plays back into the nitrogen we talked about at the beginning. You know, at the beginning, you may need that extra nitrogen. And then as you watch those lines meet up at the top at the optimum point, you can see where we really don't need that extra nitrogen anymore. So it's just like most of the biology, and with the no-till system, it just takes time. It really does. And I'm just going to throw this in before we go. A lot of people ask about a yield drag. And if you asked Al Miron, he would tell you he never had a yield drag. If you ask other people, you might hear that they had a yield drag for maybe a year or two. And I think it just depends on the year, the environment, and again, how much time you put into the things Anthony just talked about. Sometimes we can't control having a yield drag. And if you didn't leave half your farm in conventional tillage, we really don't know. You don't have much to compare it to. You really can't compare it to the neighbor because chances are they're not doing the same thing you are. So I just wanted to throw that in there because that's a very common question with not a real, like everything else, not a real solid answer, but.
Yeah, I think the savings, the time savings, the fuel savings, we don't have a chopping corn head, a roller, vertical tillage, a big disc, a big soil finisher, or a big ripper, or any of those tillage implements sitting on the farm. They don't exist. And so you're just focusing on planting, controlling pests, and harvesting. And that's what it's all about. And I think all of those savings far outweigh any loss, any difference that you would experience. I would say some of the highest yields we've ever had we experienced on our farm doing no-till. Now, could they have been higher? I don't know. Maybe, but our soil would have been in the Sioux River too. So, that's a trade-off too. You're building, you don't build a new house and don't do any maintenance for 50 years. It would be surrounded by trees, and the roof would fall in. And so that's what soil health is all about. We have to pay a maintenance fee. We have to invest something into our factory, and that's what it's all about. So. And
Garrett found your book you're talking about. Thanks, Garrett.
Thank you, Garrett.
It says it's Matt Hangney with an N.
Yes.
It has the link there. So just one resource of many, but I've heard people talk about that before. I've heard Dwayne talk about it.
Yeah, Matt was killed in an accident.
Go ahead.
No, go ahead, Peter.
Well, I was just going to throw in on Sarah's point. Now, this is just what we see at the Southeast Farm. So, take it from there. Basically, we see in a corn soybean rotation, we have better soybean yield with no-till versus tilled. And that's, replicated, repeated study. And the difference is somewhere around 1.5 bushels to 2 bushels per acre, better soybean yield on average. And in any given year, it might be up or down, but if you take a 20-year average, that's what it looks like. With the corn, we're taking a 5 or 6 bushel yield drop in a corn soybean rotation, but we could probably, the caveat there is I think you could probably manage it better because a lot of those years we didn't have good traffic control. So that's kind of a wash if you figure your soybean gain versus your corn drop at Southeast Farm, and I think you could do better, honestly. And then the other thing I would say is that when you introduce another crop into the rotation, those differences are gone. So our corn, there's even the way we manage it, which I'm historically could be better. We don't see any yield difference between conventional till and no-till corn when we have a 3-year rotation. So now if you're in a 3-year rotation, in our situation, you're doing tillage for nothing. All those expenses there's no benefit to it. And even in a 2-year rotation, when you weigh your soybean yield drop on conventional tillage versus your corn, still it doesn't pay for the tillage. And as Anthony said, that tillage involves those tillage implements. It also involves a large tractor to pull them that you got to pay for. So anyway, the economics of it to me don't favor the tillage. Plus the soil conservation side of it.
It's a lot more time. I know producers who have, taken out tillage and instead been able to add livestock. And, that's to each their own, but that freed up more time for them to be able to do that. So I don't see any more questions, and we're kind of pushing on time here. Maybe people want to go, but we do have another panel discussion tomorrow. And Anthony or Garrett, what's the title on that? That's more herbicide related, cover crops? I'm supposed to know
it's
these things.
Herbicides and cover crops. We're going to talk through some research I've did, and any questions like today we have.
Yeah, and we'll continue. Well, we want to focus on cover crops tomorrow. I know we talked about them today, and that's fine. And we can talk about tillage again tomorrow, or really it's about the 5 soil health principles. So maybe we'll end on those tomorrow. Who knows? But we'll be back. So yeah.
Well, thanks everyone for joining. I see Brian. He says in our part of the world, when moisture is at a premium in the late summer, the mythical yield drag in no-till farming becomes a major yield boost. Guess whose fields went up first? Yep.
Thank you. Yeah.
Yeah. I just wanted to mention that because it's a pretty common question. So
There's some more in the chat there too, or not? No. Okay, good. It was David. Thank you. Yep.
Well, thanks everyone. I think I can speak for the group. If you have more questions or comments, you can email any of us anytime, and we'll be happy to talk to you and appreciate the interaction. So
Yes,
hopefully we'll
thank
see you tomorrow. I'll let Anthony close out with anything else he's got.
Oh no, I'm thankful for everyone that came today, and thanks to Peter and David and Sara and Garrett, and we'll see you all again tomorrow. Have a great day.
Take it easy.